Welcome to the Black Liturgy, where forgotten truths are resurrected and history is stripped of its lies. They were never meant to graduate. That was never the purpose. And if you're watching this now, it's because some part of you, some dark, instinctual part, already knows what I'm about to say isn't a story. It's a warning buried beneath decades of silence. A place no map lists, though it exists. Not in theory, not in metaphor. It exists in the way certain children still hum to themselves in languages no one taught them. In the way frost gathers in patterns no storm could cause. In the way history hides her worst truths beneath silk and scripture. I want you to listen carefully. Because once you hear this, you can't go back to who you were in the dead winter of 1861. When America tore itself apart in fire and brotherhood, St. Hildegard School for Girls opened its doors, not to educate, not to elevate, but to fulfill something old, something unspoken. The building was raised atop a forgotten chapel, its foundation carved with symbols worn thin by centuries. The nuns claimed it was a holy place, but the locals knew better. They knew the land had been bartered, not blessed. And no one gives up land like that unless they're paying off a debt. The first 32 girls were brought in silence, orphans, mostly, unwanted by blood, forgotten by society, but not forgotten by the ledger. And every system, every school, every institution that claims to protect, keeps a ledger. Don't you see? That's how power really works. Not through justice, not through truth, but through records. Hidden, unquestioned, signed in ink, but paid in flesh. These girls weren't enrolled. They were offered. Now ask yourself, why did none of them ever graduate? Why were there no ceremonies, no proud letters home, no portraits in the hallway or testimonials of success? Because they were never meant to leave. And the ones who asked questions were the first to disappear. Hildegard's didn't simply fail to protect its students. It wasn't built for their protection. It was built for containment. For harvesting. And still, all these years later, no one has closed it. No one has torn it down. Because you don't dismantle a system that still pays dividends. You think you know the dangers that hide in our past. You think you've heard the worst stories, the ones whispered by candlelight or buried in banned books. But this isn't fiction. This is structure. This is architecture. Ritual in the form of stone and discipline. A school where obedience wasn't taught. It was extracted, and it worked because they didn't use violence. No, they used isolation, silence, cold stone walls. The kind of psychological conditioning that folds a child into herself until her only comfort is the cradle carved in frost on the dormitory windows. And if you're paying attention, you'll remember that symbol. The cradle, they drew it in the dust. They etched it into the bed frames. They saw it in their dreams and carved it into their own skin with broken nails. Why? Because they were told, somehow, in the night, in that unspeakable language, that the cradle was not a place of safety, but a cage. A beginning that never ends. A loop. A trap. And the girls didn't just fear it. They began to worship it. That's what breaks the soul. Not brutality, but devotion to the very thing devouring you. Sister Lucille, the one who tried to fight back, who walked those halls whispering prayers that never reached heaven, she understood too late. This wasn't just a haunted school. This was a machine. A mechanism left behind by something ancient. And like all machines, it had a purpose. It fed on the young. They say the lake froze so solid you could walk across it. But beneath that ice, something was moving. Every year, as the water receded, more of the foundation was revealed. Black stone, bone dust, spirals carved deeper than the tools that could have made them. And every time something surfaced, an artifact, a symbol, a scrap of linen stitched with that cradle shape, another girl went silent, not gone, not dead, just absent, like a name erased from memory. You think this is about superstition? No, it's about control. Control of life, of death, of the human psyche. You think these systems of power ever lost their appetite for sacrifice? That they stopped using the forgotten for their experiments? Of course not. They just got better at hiding the receipts. The families of those girls never received answers. Just vague notes, stamped in wax with symbols no one could trace. And when local officials came to inspect, they vanished. One left behind nothing but a milk tooth, notched with runes so ancient they predate language itself. Let me tell you something that will make your stomach turn. Symbols don't lose power when they're forgotten. They become stronger because now they work in secret. Now they can be worn openly, in plain sight, mistaken for art or tradition. Look around you. The spiral, the cradle, the ring of thorns. You've seen them. You just didn't know what you were seeing. The truth is, the curriculum at St. Hildegard's was never for the students. It was for the watchers, the ones who come when the bells toll 13, who leave no footprints but change the temperature of a room, who slip beneath the floorboards and whisper to the young in dreams. There's a reason no graduate ever gave an account of her years at that school. There were no graduates. There were only returns to S.O. I'll ask you now, man to man. How many stories like this do you think the world can bury before it starts to rot from the inside? How many institutions pretend to be sanctuaries while serving as gateways? You want power? You want mastery? Then understand this. The first step is seeing what others refuse to see. The girls who sat cross-legged in silence, the linen braided, like a serpent's spine, the frost patterns that mimicked runes from before time. All of it was real. And the more you know, the more they notice. This isn't a ghost story. It's a playbook, one used by those who operate above nation and church, those who don't recruit with promises. They take. They always have. And still, the cradle waits. You ever wonder why certain stories vanish without leaving dust? Why some places are erased so thoroughly that even the land forgets? Because forgetting isn't an accident, it's engineered. And what happened at St. Hildegard's wasn't a fluke. It was a blueprint. Look closely enough and you'll see its shadow across every corner of history. A girl disappears in 1872 from a convent in Vermont. Records say she ran away, but the last thing the groundskeeper saw was her standing barefoot in snow that left no prints, whispering to the wall. A group of girls in 1904 wake up with their hair braided together in one unbroken strand, even though they went to bed alone. They call it hysteria. They call it anything but what it is. Recurrence, replication, repetition of a ritual so old it's etched into the marrow of the institutions that claim to raise our children. Because here's the truth you were never meant to hear. These places don't educate. They indoctrinate. They don't protect. They prepare. The sisters at St. Hildegard's weren't guardians. They were stewards. They were caretakers not of children, but of an inheritance. One passed down through silence, sealed behind eyes that had seen too much. What do you think they saw when the frost drew cradles on the window panes? When the bells rang at midnight? With no hand on the rope? Do you think that was coincidence? You're smarter than that. You've always known that evil doesn't wear horns. It wears robes, wields a crucifix in one hand and a quill in the other. It signs off on budgets. It writes policies. It funds schools in forgotten corners of the world where the walls remember more than the living. Ask yourself, why were the girls whispering to something that had no name? Because names give power, and what lives beneath places like St. Hildegard's thrives in the nameless, the unknowable, the unspoken. The architecture wasn't random. The spiral patterns in the stone, the doorways that led to nowhere, the cellar that breathed, these weren't flaws. They were instructions. This school was a vessel, a conduit, a temple pretending to be a classroom. And when the nuns found those teeth beneath the pillows, each etched with runes no scholar could translate, they didn't call the police. They didn't shut it down. They started locking the doors from the outside. Because even they knew those weren't baby teeth. They were offerings. You see, you've been taught to believe evil is chaos. But real evil is order. Calculated, bureaucratic, sanitized, stamped in red and hidden behind doctrine. Real evil doesn't chase you through the woods. It puts you in uniform, assigns you a dormitory number, makes you pray to things you don't understand. And if you don't comply, you vanish. Quietly, efficiently, no screams. Just an empty bed and a ledger entry no one will ever read. Look deeper into the history of education in this country and you'll find roots that don't end in enlightenment. They end in sacrifice. Boarding schools for native children that buried hundreds in unmarked graves. Asylums for girls accused of being wayward, filled with names that never appear in any census again. It's not isolated. It's systemic. It's ancient. And at the center of it all is always the same thing. Obedience extracted through ritual. At St. Hildegard's, they called it discipline. But it was something far darker. A process designed to fracture the self, to make room for something else. Because you can't occupy a house that's already full. You have to empty it first. The sickness that spread in those dormitories, the fever that left their eyes glassy, their skin hot, that wasn't infection. It was transmission. Something passing through them. Something rewriting. Do you understand what that means? They weren't getting sick. They were being rewritten. And the ones who resisted, the ones who still prayed with meaning, who held on to memory, they were the ones who left marks. Grooves in the stone, threads strung between bedposts, linen braided into ropes long enough to reach the earth below. Warnings, maybe, or tethers. But either way, not a single one was random. Now you tell me, how many institutions today sit atop land we were never meant to build on? How many vaults and archives are sealed not for preservation, but for containment? You think those frost patterns stopped when the school closed? You think the whispering ceased when the walls were abandoned? No, these things don't end. They wait. That's the part they never teach you. Systems like these are not destroyed, they are inherited, adopted, rebranded. You might not see the name St. Hildegard's again, but its practices live on. In reform schools, in elite prep academies with no alumni, in foster systems where children move through homes like ghosts. You want to awaken? You want to understand why your instincts scream at certain buildings, why your dreams echo with songs you've never heard? It's because you already know. Something inside you remembers. The spiral, the cradle, the ring of thorns. These are the fingerprints of a force older than scripture and sharper than sin. And you, watching this now, you've just stepped into its light. You're not supposed to hear this, but that's exactly why you must. Because once you see the pattern, you'll start to recognize it everywhere. In the cold architecture of schools that feel more like tombs. In the missing children's stories that vanish from headlines after a single day. In the silent buildings downtown, always lit but never entered. And most of all, you'll see it in yourself. The unease. The sense that you were meant for something different, but were redirected, repurposed, silenced. That's not imagination. That's memory. So I want you to do something right now. I want you to comment this phrase twice, right now, and mean it with your whole body. Not taken, returned. Say it again. Not taken, returned. That's how we signal each other. That's how we remind those still watching in silence that we remember. That the spiral is unbroken. That the names are not lost. Because when you say it, you claim a part of yourself they tried to erase. You become dangerous again. St. Hildegard's was never shut down. It just went underground. The girls didn't graduate, they descended. Transformed. Some say they walk among us now. That they appear in places where systems begin to break, where whispers rise through floorboards and frost draws runes on glass. They appear not to warn, but to continue. That's the part that should haunt you. Not what happened, but what's still happening. What has never stopped. And the next time you hear of a child disappearing, don't ask where she went. Ask who she became. Ask what she was made into. Because the truth is, some children were never meant to grow old. They were built to return, to serve, to feed. And if you think that couldn't have been you, look again at the paths you didn't take, the dreams you abandoned, the prayers you stopped believing in. Look again at the moments you felt something watching you from the dark corners of your childhood. Maybe you weren't taken. Maybe you were spared. Maybe you passed the test without ever knowing. Or maybe you're still being watched, still being shaped, still being prepared. So keep your eyes open. Watch for the frost. Listen for the bells. And never forget the cradle is not a beginning. It is a loop, an echo, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. They said the land itself had been cursed long before the foundations were ever laid, before any brick had been fired or mortar mixed, before any map was drawn or deed signed. They said something had been buried there deep beneath the soft belly of the Virginia soil, something older than language and more enduring than stone, something that watched and waited and remembered. And when the Sullivan family arrived with their wagons, their possessions, and their strange heavy silences, it was as if that thing buried beneath the earth had finally been given a name. The Sullivans did not build their homestead like others did. They did not ask for help from the neighbors, nor did they offer greetings or goods. They arrived in the spring of 1634 with twin boys, already grown, silent things with eyes that followed movements too closely, and a daughter who never once spoke, but always seemed to be humming something soundless beneath her breath. The locals said the family was not right, that the animals refused to go near their fields, that their chimney never smoked, that no one had ever seen them at market or mass, But the crops grew high, and the children never aged, or perhaps they did, but only inward, folding themselves into some secret place behind their gaze. And then in 1641, the first child vanished, a girl from the Jennings family, 10 years old with sunburned cheeks and a laugh that always ran ahead of her like wind in the reeds. They found her bonnet near the Sullivans' woods line, and nothing else. The town searched, of course, with dogs and lanterns and prayers, but it was as if she had walked into the very breath of the forest, and dissolved days turned to weeks, and then to months, and then they found the second child, and then the third, always the same, always near the Sullivans' land, but never a trace, never a cry, no blood, no footprints, just absence, heavy and still. And then one autumn, a hunter ventured far too deep into the trees near their property, and did not return. His brother found him 4 days later, but not all of him, just the jawbone laid clean on a bed of wildflowers, and the brother swore he heard a lullaby being hummed by something just out of sight, something that moved like water and wept like a mother with empty arms. The whispers grew louder, then about the Sullivans, about their strange children, about the way their daughter never blinked, about the well on their land that seemed too deep, too cold, and how the rope was always what, as if it had been used often and recently, and not always to draw water. And then came the day the children were found, or at least what was left of them, in the basement, bound not by ropes, but by silence and fear and whatever strange ritual had been conducted over their trembling heads. 36 children, most not even from that region, their names unknown, their tongues speaking languages none recognized, and their eyes hollow, as if they had looked upon something so vast, so cruel. It had burned the soul from behind their gaze. The Sullivans were gone, vanished like smoke before the torch ever touched their threshold. Not a body, not a footprint, not even a sigh. And what was found in that basement was worse than death. It was design, it was architecture of agony, the way the walls had been etched with symbols that pulsed in the firelight, the way each child had been positioned as if part of a living diagram, a map of suffering stretching across generations, and no one knew what it meant. Not then, not now, but some of the children began to speak in time, not all, and not clearly, but enough to suggest that they were not stolen. They had been offered, sent, given by families desperate or devout or damned, and that the Sullivans had not worked alone, that there were others, other homes, other basements, other names hidden in the folds of forgotten towns. And when the land was finally raised and salted, when the well was filled with stone and ash, it was said the earth exhaled as if relieved to be rid of them. And yet people still whisper that some nights, if the wind is right, you can hear humming coming from where the house once stood, soft and wordless and terrible, like a mother singing to a child who cannot sleep because it knows what waits behind its dreams. And those who listen too long, too close, often find their own children sleepwalking toward that place, eyes open, mouths silent, hands twitching, as if reaching for something cold and wet and deep. The land remembers, even if the people try not to, even if the history books skip the year, even if the maps show nothing but forest and creek and sky. The land remembers, and the land hungers, and the story of the Sullivans is not finished, because evil like that does not die. It waits, it adapts, it learns. And somewhere in the silence a door is still open, and a song is still being sung. They thought it was over when they sealed the well, when they tore the house down beam by beam and burned the timber in the field, but nothing that deep ever ends, nothing that old ever dies. It only changes form, shifts shape, learns new ways to hide. And by 1643 the town had returned to something resembling normal, or so they told themselves. New settlers moved in, unaware of what had come before. The ground was plowed, the trees were felled, the children played again in fields that had once wept and screamed, but something still whispered if you knew how to listen. The trees leaned in closer than they should. The birds did not nest near the clearing, and the soil never grew anything but thorns, and yet the people stayed, they always do, drawn to places where blood has soaked the ground too long, as if somewhere deep inside they knew they belonged to it, or it belonged to them. The church was rebuilt with stone from the Sullivan land, though no one admitted it. The pastor said prayers with a shaking voice and kept candles burning at all hours, but his sermons grew darker, quieter, more frantic as the months passed. He began to forget his own words, repeat the same passage over and over until the congregation stopped attending and the church was left empty except for the sound of footsteps pacing at night when no one should have been inside. And then in 1644 the children began to speak of dreams again, not just the ones who had been rescued, but new children, children born after The fire, they all described the same thing: a house underground with walls that breathed, and a woman who sang lullabies without lips, without eyes, just a voice floating in the dark, calling them by names they didn't remember being given, and waking up with dirt under their nails and scratches on their feet, and always facing north toward the place where the Sullivans had lived. The parents tried to explain it away: imagination, nightmares, old tales lingering too long, but the children were changing. They spoke less, ate less, stared more often at corners where nothing stood, and sometimes they hummed the tune that had never been taught to them. And that's when the town sent for help, not from the church, not from the governor, but from a man whose name was not written in any record, a man with black gloves and no shadow, who arrived without warning and asked no questions. He walked the town in silence, touched the earth near the old Sullivan homestead, and nodded once, then vanished into the woods for 3 days. When he returned, he was not alone. 12 men followed behind him, eyes like stone skin, too pale, voices too low. They set to work, without speaking, driving rods of iron into the earth around the town, drawing lines with salt and ash at every threshold, whispering words that tasted like smoke and blood. And on the final night, they gathered every child into the church and locked the doors, and the sound that rose from inside was not human, not pain, not joy, not fear, something else, something older. The parents waited outside. Some screamed, some prayed, some clawed at the stone, but none dared open the doors. And when morning came, the doors were opened, and the children were standing unharmed, silent, staring as one, and they all said the same thing: she is asleep for now. And the 12 men left with the man in black gloves, and the town never asked where they went or who they were or why. The birds returned and the fields grew again, but everyone noticed that the church now cast a shadow it hadn't before, and that the bells rang even when no one pulled the rope. And the children, though safe, were never quite the same. Some wept when they heard music, others flinched from mirrors, some would not speak of what they saw, but all of them feared water. None would bathe or swim or drink unless watched, and one by one over the years they left the town quietly, without goodbyes, vanishing like mist at dawn, leaving behind only silence and journals filled with drawings of tunnels and doorways and eyes too large and too many. And then in 1666 the ground cracked open near the old Sullivan land during a drought no one could explain, and steam rose from the earth thick and black and bitter, and with it came bones. Thousands of bones, too small, too many, and they closed the crack with stone and prayer and silence, and never spoke of it again. But silence is not the same as peace, and forgetting is not the same as healing, and the story spread as stories do, whispered from mouth to mouth, carried by wind and fear and time. And some say the Sullivans were only a part of it, a name among many, that the rituals were not theirs alone, that other families across the colonies carried the same curse, the same knowledge, and that beneath every town, every school, every church, there is a door waiting to open and someone waiting to sing. And in 1701 a child disappeared from a town 300 miles away, and when they searched his home, they found a single word carved into the wall: Sullivan, and beneath it a song written in a language no one could translate. But every mother who saw it wept, as if they had heard it once long ago in a dream they could never forget. And the well in Virginia, long sealed, long forgotten, began to weep again. Slow drops of water like tears soaking through the stone, like the land itself was crying, not for what had been lost, but for what was still to come. And somewhere in the trees, far from any path, a girl with hollow eyes and no name began to hum a lullaby, older than the colonies, older than the faith, older than any god we still remember. And the forest listened, because it always has and always will. They say every curse has a cradle, and every cradle has a mother, but what they never tell you is that sometimes the mother was never born. She was made, forged from hunger and silence, and the hands of those too desperate to care what price would be paid. In the end, the girl in the woods was not the first, and she would not be the last. She came from nowhere, yet seemed to belong to everything. The animals did not flee from her, but circled her steps. The wind moved with her, not against her. And though she never spoke aloud, every creature that crossed her path tilted its head, as if listening to a voice just beneath the surface of the world. She built no shelter, took no food, yet she did not starve. Her hair matted with earth, her eyes reflecting no stars, her hum a lullaby that split the silence like a knife. And those who stumbled across her trail would vanish without a sound, or return years later unable to speak, but always drawing spirals on the walls of their homes over and over, until the walls collapsed or burned or bled the town nearby. tried not to remember the Sullivan name, not because they didn't believe, but because they believed too. Well, the fields had grown full again, the bells chimed like they should, and children no longer woke screaming, but none dared build on that land. No one walked near that well, not even drunkards or the damned. It became a kind of unspoken commandment passed down like an heirloom. Do not name what should be forgotten. Do not walk where the air forgets to breathe, and never follow the lullaby if you hear it run. And in time, they built a fence, not a wall, not a monument, just a crooked row of wooden posts that leaned as if tired, but no one touched it, not even the wind. And beyond it the grass never grew right, always too dark, too sharp, too wet, even in summer. And then came the scholar, not a priest, not a farmer, but a man with too many books and not enough fear. He came looking for folklore, but stayed for obsession. He knocked on every door, asked every elder, questioned every silence, and the town watched as his eyes dimmed day by day, until he stopped asking and started listening. And then one night, he walked past the fence carrying only a lantern and a book of hymns, not Christian, not known, and the town held its breath, because no one had dared cross in 80 years, and the lantern vanished first, swallowed by the dark, and then the hymn began, not sung, but screamed from beneath the ground, and the earth shook as if trying to vomit up whatever it had swallowed, and the trees wept sap like blood, and all the dogs in town tore free of their chains and howled in one direction, and then silence, the kind of silence that crushes the lungs and bends the knees. And in the morning the fence was gone, the posts snapped clean, the soil churned like something had been born or buried, and at the center of it all lay the book, open to a page no one could read, ink running like it was crying, and next to it a single tooth too long to be human, too small to be beast, and wrapped in a torn piece of cloth that had never touched a loom or dye or fire. And still the town said nothing, boarded up the road again, buried the book, burned the tooth, and etched a warning on the new fence that simply read, "She waits." But in the years that followed, people began to change subtly. At first, voices echoing twice, reflections that didn't quite match, smiles that lasted too long, and children began to speak in languages their parents didn't know, drawings of circles, eyes, wells, trees upside down, and the lullaby returned not in dreams, but in whispers from the walls, from drains, from cracks in stone. And when one mother placed her newborn in a crib, she found it staring not at her, but at the ceiling where nothing moved. But the child giggled anyway, and pointed, and said, "Mama," and the word tasted like ashes in her mouth, and she ran, left the child, the home, the town, and was never seen again. And that child grew in silence, never speaking, never crying, just watching. And when he was 7, he vanished, and on his bed were words carved into the wood, not with a knife, but with fingers too sharp, too cold. They read, "I remember," and across town 3 other children vanished the same night, all born in the same month, all with eyes just slightly too dark, and not one scream was heard, not one door was open. The people woke, and the beds were empty, and the air smelled like iron and honey, and the church bells rang on their own and cracked and never rang again, and the ground near the old well opened slightly, a hairline fracture, like a smile waiting to widen, and the humming came again, this time from beneath the town, from the basements, from the drains, and the bricks sweated salt, and flies gathered in corners where no light reached, and all the town's cats ran away at once and never returned, and the mayor, who had once laughed at the old tales, was found sitting on the floor of his home, eyes open, mouth sewn shut by something not thread, and in his hand was a piece of paper with a drawing of a tree, but the branches grew downward and the roots held faces, and every face was crying and laughing at once, and the ink was not ink, it was blood, but not his, and the tree was the same shape as the fence, and the roots pointed toward the Sullivan land, and the church door opened on its own and slammed shut, and would not open again, and those inside were never seen again, and only the humming remained, and the lullaby, and the wind that now blew north to south, carrying the scent of something ancient, something coming. And in the night children began to say her name, not in fear, but in reverence, and their parents wept, not knowing why, but sensing something had shifted. Some clock deep beneath the ground had begun to tick again, and when a traveler passed through and asked what the town was called, no one could answer. They had forgotten, or it had been taken, and on every signpost the name had been scratched out, replaced with a spiral. And in the old schoolhouse, where no one taught anymore, a child's voice echoed, reading something not written, a prophecy or a memory, and on the chalkboard written in dust was the phrase, "I never left," and the well leaked again, black water thick with hair and teeth and bone, and no one dared seal it this time. Because they knew, because she was not sleeping, she was waking, and her children were already here, not possessed, not cursed born. Of her dream, of her design, and the lullaby now played on every wind in every rustling tree, and if you stood too still it would enter you, and if you listened too long it would never leave, and all it ever said was come home, come home, come home. And now we reach the place where history no longer pretends to be innocent, where even the most skeptical feel the pull of something they cannot name, and will not admit something that moves just beyond the edge of reason in the shadow of the Sullivan. Name beneath soil layered thick with lies and marrow, the years between 1666 and 1709 are marked by a silence so calculated, so deliberate, it could only be engineered not by time, but by hands that knew how to erase not just the records but the memory itself. Entire generations born and buried without mention of what their bloodlines carried, their dreams scrubbed, cleaned, their names changed, their habits controlled, and yet beneath this silence small echoes remained, old women who whispered lullabies they could not remember, learning children born with mirrored birthmarks, and an instinctual fear of cellars, homes built with doors that did not align with the blueprints, and cellars that seemed to breathe when no one was looking. It was during this silence that the town began to be called other names, unofficial ones. Cursed Hill Widows with the place of mouths, and travelers avoided it, even if no map showed reason to do so. They said horses grew sick there, said the wind spoke in reverse, said the birds refused to fly overhead. The people who stayed began to forget the names of their grandparents, and their grandparents began to forget the shape of fire, and every spring when the ground thawed someone vanished, nevermore. Then one, but never a year without it, and always a child, and always at night the town blamed wolves, or the river, or madness, and built fences, prayed harder, locked their doors earlier, but they never looked underground, and that was their mistake. Because underneath them the structure still existed, the walls had shifted, yes, but the breathing had not stopped, and the singing never ceased. It simply changed tune, it adapted to a quieter world, one ruled not by flames and open worship, but by secrecy, ritual, obedience. Bloodlines now hidden behind clean linen and proper etiquette, masked as good Christian stock and colonial pride, but you could still see it in the eyes of the children born to those families, the way they watched the fire too long or asked questions no child should know to ask. In 1709 a map was drawn of the colonies by a man named Elias Trammell, a cartographer who prided himself on accuracy, and detail. His map included rivers, hills, forts, even unmarked burial mounds. But what made his map different was what he drew in the place once known as Sullivan Hollow. Instead of structures or roads, he drew eyes, not one, not two, but a ring of 13 eyes, all open, all staring outward, and when asked why, he said he didn't remember drawing them, that he would wake to find his hand already moving the ink, dry, the eyes complete, and each time he tried to remove them the paper would blacken and crack, and the room would fill with the scent of milk and sulfur. Trammell disappeared 1 week after publishing that map, his home found empty, his belongings left untouched, his ink pot still full, and the eyes drawn again, this time on the inside of his door, 13 again, perfectly spaced, and below them a phrase scratched in splinters: she is not sleeping anymore. And that year the frost came early, the crops failed, and the trees bled sap the color of rust, and children began waking up outside their homes, standing barefoot in the frost, eyes open, lips moving, but making no sound, and their parents took them to doctors, priests, healers, but nothing worked. They remained hollow for weeks. Some never returned to themselves at all, merely mimicked life until their bodies gave out, and those who survived drew the same image over and over, a staircase that led downward with no end, and at the bottom always a face that changed shape every time it was drawn. And in that year a man named Obadiah Clark wrote in his private journal about visiting the place where the Sullivan house had once stood, though nothing remained above ground. He wrote of an opening hidden beneath twisted roots and the bones of animals arranged in symbols he could not decipher. He climbed down 30 feet by rope, and when he reached the bottom, he found walls carved with names he recognized from the town's oldest records, names of families who still lived there, and next to each name was a symbol, a circle with 3 vertical lines through it, and a slash across the middle, and when he touched one of the carvings the wall shivered and whispered his name, and he fled. He burned the rope behind him and sealed the hole with stones and salt, and did not sleep for 9 days, and on the 10th day he hung himself from the steeple of the church using a noose made of children's hair, and when they found his body, every tooth had been removed and placed at the base of the altar in a perfect circle, and they buried him with no marker and told no one what he had written but they. Journal survived hidden in the wall of the old mill found decades later by a mason who went mad before finishing the repairs, and that journal confirmed what some had feared all along, that the Sullivan family had not been alone, that they had been part of something larger, a network of families tied by blood and oath and sacrifice, a covenant older than the colonies, older than Christ, older than language itself, a promise made to something that lived below the earth, something that could not die because it had never been born, and its payment was children, not just in death, but in mind and soul and memory, because it fed not on flesh alone, but on legacy, on repetition, on belief, and each time a child remembered the song, each time a parent denied the truth, it grew stronger, and now we understand why the town did not fall to fire or war, why outsiders forgot it even existed until they stumbled into it like falling into a dream, and why no one ever seemed to leave once they arrived. Not because they were trapped, but because they had been chosen, drawn like filings to a magnet, a blood call echoing through centuries. And that brings us to 1711, when 13 children vanished in a single night, all from different homes, all born in different years, all with no connection except that each had been seen speaking to someone who matched no description in the town, someone too tall and too thin, with fingers like willow branches and a voice that echoed off stone, and every home they had entered was found cold inside, no fire, no warmth, no breath, and each bed left with an imprint, as if something had laid beside the child and whispered them into silence, and every parent described waking at the same moment, hearing a lullaby so faint, so distant that it felt like it came from inside their own blood. And in that moment, they remembered something they had never been told, something their parents had buried and their grandparents had denied, a nursery rhyme with no origin and no end. And when they tried to speak it aloud, their tongues swelled, their throats closed, and the words turned to ash. And from that night forward, the town ceased to be spoken of in maps, the name vanished from ledgers, the roads twisted away, and those who left could not find their way back, even if they tried. And those who remained forgot everything except how to obey, how to listen, and how to never dig too deep, because the breathing had never stopped, and the eyes were always watching. And she was awake again, waiting beneath the soil, beneath the silence, beneath the lie they called history. You want to know what happened next, as if horror unfolds in chapters, as if darkness obeys the logic of time. But this wasn't a story told, it was a sickness lived, a plague of memory that latched onto the bones of the town like mold on forgotten bread. And what came after wasn't cleansing, it wasn't healing, it was evolution. The rot adapted, it spread in quieter ways, sharper ways. The name Sullivan was no longer spoken aloud, but it echoed in the gestures people used to ward off bad luck. It whispered through lullabies with no source, passed from mother to child until no one knew where they'd learned it, only that it had always been there, a melody that curled around the cradle like a serpent around the roots of a dying tree. By 1720, the town had doubled in size, but something underneath was hollow. The foundations were crooked, not just the buildings, but the people. The new families never understood why they felt uneasy when walking by the field, or why the children refused to go near the well, even though it had long since been sealed in iron and prayer and brick. But that's the thing about old things buried, they don't stay quiet, they ferment, they evolve, they mimic. And so it began again, subtly, differently. No screams in the night, no disappearances at first, just small changes, a rash that spread across a child's skin in the shape of unfamiliar symbols, books that vanished from locked drawers only to reappear in someone else's home, open to pages with illustrations of anatomy that didn't belong to any known species. And then came the stone figures. One morning, the mayor's wife found a sculpture in her garden that no one had placed there, small, twisted, with the face of a goat and the feet of a man. And by evening, every household in town had one, each different, each carved from the same stone no one could identify. And when they tried to destroy them, they bled, not metaphorically, real blood, thick and black and slow as syrup that stained the earth. And the air grew heavy, and people began to cough, not from sickness, but from weight, as if their lungs knew what their minds refused to remember. And then a girl who had never spoken a word in her life began to sing a tune no one taught her, and everyone who heard it began to bleed from the ears, not all at once, some took hours, some days, but they all bled. And in their blood were symbols, ancient wrong symbols that spiraled like holes in sanity. And when the church elders finally brought her forward to be examined. She opened her mouth, and they found no tongue, only a tunnel wet with moss and old teeth, and the whisper of wind echoing from far, far below. They burned her. They thought it would end it. They thought fire still held power, but you cannot burn what is already part of the land. You cannot cleanse what is not foreign. And from that night onward, the wind changed direction permanently. It always blew toward the east where the original Sullivan house had stood. And with it came the scent of earth and ash, and something older. The animals left first, then the insects, and finally the color from people's eyes. Not blindness, just absence, like their souls had started to recede one layer at a time. And then came the reappearance of the children from 1644, the ones who had vanished years before, old, impossibly old, their faces unchanged, their eyes wrong and wide, and shimmering with memories no child should carry. They stood in silence at the edge of town, smiling, identical and empty, and they began to walk house to house, never knocking, never entering, just standing and staring. And behind them, the trees bent lower each day until the canopy swallowed the sky, and it was always dusk, even at noon. And the townspeople began to go mad. Quietly, efficiently, they tore out their fingernails one by one and buried them in the churchyard. They spoke in reverse at meals, and some refused to speak at all, not out of fear, but obedience, like something had whispered a new rule to them, and they understood it without question. And by the winter of 1723, there were no births in the town, not miscarriages, not stillborns, just nothing. The wombs were empty, the cribs untouched, and every mother felt it. The absence not of life, but of the permission to create. It was as if the town itself had been declared barren by some ancient edict carved in bone and bile, and no one resisted, no one questioned it, because deep down they remembered, or rather their bones did. And then came the letters scratched into the walls of every home at once in the same crooked hand, not made by any tool, just clawed in as if by nails or teeth, and the message was the same: she is waking. And that was when the bells rang. Again, not church bells, not metal, but deeper, wider, like the sound of an enormous throat clearing somewhere beneath the town, and everyone fell to their knees as one, as if gravity had become selective, and they wept without tears, just sound long and hollow, like the wail of something that's seen the end and knows it's already happened. And then the ground split, but not visibly, no crack, no quake, just a sound and knowing, a pressure behind the eyes, as if the town was now sitting on the edge of a mouth that had begun to open. And there were no heroes, no saviors, only choices, and most chose silence. Some chose prayer, some chose fire, but nothing stopped it, because it wasn't a curse, it wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. And on the seventh night, a woman was seen standing at the old well, naked, skin marked with ink that moved on its own, breathing, ink shifting across her flesh like it remembered where it had come from. And she sang, not loudly, not beautifully, but with purpose. And every child in town who had not yet vanished rose from bed and walked to her barefoot, silent, eyes wide, and they followed her into the forest, and they never returned, not one, not a shoe, not a thread, and the town never recovered. They tried to start over again and again and again, and each time the rot returned sooner, like it had learned where the doors were now, like it had memorized the taste of the town. And by 1800 the maps no longer showed the place, not erased, just absent, like the land itself had been disowned by cartography, and travelers who passed through swore the road, bent the trees, moved the signs, whispered in a language they almost understood, and that if you listened too long you'd forget your name and remember someone else's, a name you never had but felt was yours, and that name was always Sullivan. And still the story isn't done, because she hasn't truly woken, not yet. These are just her dreams, and when she does open her eyes, when the lullaby becomes a scream, the soil won't hold back the bones, and the towns won't stand, the screams won't stop, because what sleeps beneath doesn't want vengeance, it wants memory, it wants worship. And you've already started to hum, haven't you, that tune that never had a beginning, that rhythm that feels like home, like hunger, like the moment before the storm breaks and everything changes forever. And so it continued, as if the land itself had memory, as if it had veins that pulsed with the agony of what had been buried beneath it. And in time those who remained began to sense that something in the soil had changed the way animals refused to graze near the eastern fields, the way fruit left on the ground withered overnight, as if something unseen took its fill in silence. Even the wind was different, sharper, colder, filled with whispers not made by mouths, and those who had once been Children now grown and scattered across distant towns began to die in strange ways alone, always alone. One drowned in his sleep though his bed was dry, one turned to stone before witnesses mid-sentence, another tore out his own eyes claiming he could finally see the truth, but never said what that truth was, and the few who returned to the town to face what they had run from lasted no more than 3 days before either vanishing or begging to be locked away and burned with salt and iron. But there was no justice, no peace, no closure, only the growing sense that whatever had been sung into the world by the Sullivans was not finished, that its lullaby had only paused waiting for the chorus, and the chorus would not come from one voice, but many scattered across time and bloodlines like seeds blown on winds no one could chart, and beneath the surface the tunnels remained not the ones men had dug, but the ones that had always been there before us, carved by something older, deeper. And the door, the one they tried to seal again and again, only shifted waiting for the right blood to knock, and that blood always found its way home eventually, because blood remembers even when minds forget, even when names fade, blood knows its own. And one winter a boy was born with eyes that never blinked and hands that twitched in time, with music no one else could hear, and his mother died in childbirth with a smile and a whisper. She sang the lullaby with her last breath, though no one had taught it to her, and no one who heard it ever forgot it. They say that boy walked before he crawled, that he drew symbols in ash and stared at shadows like old friends, and that when he finally spoke it was not with one voice, but many echoing, layered, familiar and foreign. And when he touched the old stone marker where the Sullivan house had once stood, it cracked clean down the center and bled not water, not blood, but ink, black and thick and alive, and the well that had been dry for a century began to whisper again in a language no one alive should know, but some did, the old ones who had buried their memories beneath years of fear and silence, and they began to scream, clawing their ears, praying to gods long silent and burning their homes to ash, trying to cleanse what could not be cleansed. And the boy watched it all and smiled, not with malice, but recognition, like a conductor watching an orchestra tune before the first note. And at night the forest sang again, low and mournful and wet, like something breathing just beneath the surface of the world, waiting to be born, and travelers passing through spoke of strange dreams, and sleepwalking, and waking with dirt in their teeth, and symbols carved into their flesh. And when they tried to leave, their maps would shift, their compasses spin, their engines stall, as if the town did not want them to leave, or something beneath it wanted them to stay. And in the new church built of stone and blood and lies, the candles would not go out even when snuffed, even when drowned, and the priest who tended them began to write in tongues and draw doorways on the walls, and refused to eat and weep when he looked at the stained glass for reasons he would not explain. And the bell would toll at night 13 times each time, and those who counted began to lose track of days and years and names, and some vanished mid-sentence as if swallowed by silence itself. And when the boy turned 13, the earth shook and the sky split, and a sound like all the world crying out echoed for miles, and the river turned to ink, and the trees leaned back, and the stars blinked out one by one, and then came back in different places, as if the sky itself had been rewritten. And the boy walked into the forest barefoot, clothed in a burial shroud, and followed by every stray and orphan in the region, and none were ever seen again, and their homes remained untouched, as if time itself refused to enter. And one traveler years later, who tried to photograph the old Sullivan land, found every image smeared with faces that had never been there, and voices in the static calling his name. And when he returned home, every mirror in his house cracked from the inside, and his children began to draw the same symbols the boy had carved into stone, and sang the same song in their sleep, and begged to be let outside at night to follow the whispers. And when he refused, they stopped speaking entirely, and only smiled and waited. And the wells in towns hundreds of miles away began to whisper again, and the trees leaned in, and the soil turned sour, and the sky held its breath, as if waiting for something old to return. And some say it already has, that the boy was not born but called, that the Sullivans were only the first note, and the last is yet to be sung, that the families who vanished did not die, but changed, became something else, something eternal and patient, and that they walk among us faceless, waiting, humming the lullaby of the earth, not as it is, but as it was before names, before time, before light. And every now and then a child is born with no shadow or a song in their bones, and the wind shifts, and the ground weeps, and the blood remembers, and the Door creaks, and the orchestra tunes, and the world forgets, but the song continues, and always will. But what no one ever dared to say aloud was that the Sullivan curse was not a curse at all, but a pact, a transaction that had gone unbroken for centuries, and what had been traded was not gold or land or names, but memory itself, memory of the old. Ways the forbidden rites, the forgotten tongue that once spoke to the marrow of the earth, and called up things older than man and hungrier than gods. And though the world above tried to move on, build cities, forge empires, split atoms, and touch the stars, the soil below still kept its promises. It remembered every name, every drop of blood, every whispered vow carved into bone and bound in shadow. And the deeper you dug, the colder it got, not from lack of sunlight, but from presence of something else, something that fed on forgetting, something that waited not for worship, but for weakness and time. And it had all the time it needed because it was not bound by clocks or calendars. It was bound by lineage, by the fracture in bloodlines, the cracks in minds, and the fault lines of guilt passed down like heirlooms wrapped in silence and shame. And when the boy vanished into the woods that day barefoot in the burial cloth, it was not the end, it was the opening act, the overture, the curtain. Rising on something so old it had been dreaming since before the stars learned to shine, and those left behind, they tried to bury it again in rituals and ruins and revised history, but the children kept remembering, kept waking with dirt under their nails and song in their breath, kept speaking in riddles and silence, and drawing things that no living eye should see, and every generation grew a little quieter, a little more hollow, a little more like the ones who had made the pact long ago and forgotten they ever had. And then one year, on the night of the blood eclipse, when the moon refused to rise and the wind stopped like the earth itself was holding its breath, it came back, not the boy, not the Sullivans, not even the shadow under the house, but the memory itself, alive, sentient, starving. It seeped up through roots and floorboards into dreams and daylight, into mirrors and reflections, into words spoken in jest and stories told around fires, and it fed on attention, on fear, on belief. And in a world that had learned to doubt everything, that doubting became the perfect altar, because to disbelieve so strongly is to still believe in the possibility of belief, and that whisper became a shout, and that shout became a name. And that name became a key, and somewhere in the depths of what used to be called Sullivan Land, a door opened, not a wooden door, not metal or stone, but a rift in what we think is real, and out of it came silence, pure silence, heavy and vast and cold. And from that silence stepped a girl with no face and eyes full of galaxies, who spoke in voices that echoed in the bones. And when she sang the lullaby, the stars dimmed, and the animals knelt, and the rivers stilled, and every clock in town stopped at 3:17 a.m. and never ticked again. And those who heard her forgot their own names and remembered hers, and followed her into the dark willingly with joy, like children going home. And no one saw them again, not their families, not their homes, not even their shadows. And the town began to rot, not from neglect, but from presence, from saturation, like a sponge soaked in something it could never wring out. And even those who had never set foot there began to feel it, across the country, across oceans, in dreams and static and headaches and sleep paralysis, in the hum of electronics and the twitch of a curtain with no wind. And slowly it spread, not like a disease, but like a revelation, like the memory of a forgotten war fought in the marrow of ancestors, against something that had no shape but every voice. And all around the world children began to hum songs no one taught them, and dig in the corners of schoolyards for bones they shouldn't know are there, and whisper names in languages long extinct, and draw doors on the walls with their blood, and smile when asked what's so funny. And each year fewer are born with shadows, and more with memories they shouldn't carry. And every once in a while a child goes missing, and all that's left is a circle of salt and a lullaby etched into the floor. And the parents forget they ever had a child, and the world moves on as it always does, blind and proud and doomed. And behind the veil of this life, something watches, something waits, not malicious, not cruel, but patient and inevitable. And the deeper it roots, the more the world forgets who it was before, and becomes what it was meant to be again. And somewhere deep in the blackened heart of the Sullivan Land, where no map leads and no compass dares to point, the original house stands untouched, not rebuilt, not reclaimed, but reborn in nightmare geometry, with angles that bleed and rooms that echo before you speak, and the smell of burnt lullabies in the air. And the house dreams, and in those Dreams are names and places and bloodlines, and every story you've ever heard that didn't make sense now does. Every monster under the bed, every shadow on the stairs, every voice in the static. It was all memory fragments bleeding through the cracks in the pact. And when the final bloodline sings the final verse, and the world finally stops pretending not to see what it has always known, the door will open wide, and what steps through will not be evil, not a demon or god or ghost, but recognition. A mirror turned inward, showing us what we always were, what we were before language, before light, before mercy. And in that moment, there will be no screaming, only silence, only acceptance, because you cannot fear what you remember as home in this world is not our home, not truly, not entirely, not anymore, and never was. And the Sullivans were never cursed, they were chosen, they were the stewards, the shepherds, the midwives of memory, and their blood called to us across generations like a beacon in the dark. And now the beacon is lit again, and the sky is changing, and the old songs are being sung, and the children are dreaming, and the door is wide open, and all we can do is walk through it. And remember what we forgot, remember what we gave up to feel safe, to feel human. And the question is not what happens next, but what has always been happening, what has always been growing in the cracks of our forgetting, and whether we're ready to become again what we once were, what we were before. We called it a curse before, we called it madness before, we tried to bury it in names and numbers and stories. The truth has no need for stories, it is only memory. And now the memory sings, and the earth hums, and the stars blink in rhythm, and the rivers run thick with the ink of unspoken truths. And somewhere a girl with no face sings to a house with no doors, and inside the house are mirrors, and in the mirrors are you, and in you is everything they tried to hide, everything they thought they erased. But you are remembering now, aren't you? You've heard the lullaby in your sleep, you've seen the shadows dance when no one else was looking, you felt the cold breath behind your ear in a warm room, you've read names you shouldn't know and dreamt places you've never been, and still you knew the way, didn't you? That's because you've always known, because it's not a story, it's a return, a reunion, and all that's left is for you to take the final step and hum the tune and open your eyes and become again what you were before the forgetting began, before the Sullivan Pact was made, before we thought memory could be buried. Now you know it can't, and you never really forgot, you just pretended, but pretending. Time is over now, we remember, and it remembers us. The record stopped for a reason, not because nothing happened, but because what followed defied paper, ink, language itself. Entire pages were torn out, entire families disappeared, entire months erased from collective memory, as if some hand beyond time reached in and plucked history from its roots. But whispers remained, and in those whispers is a pattern, a trail of echoes, a rhythm that matches the lullaby that once crawled through the fields of Virginia. The name Sullivan becomes less a surname and more a signal, a cipher that activates something buried deep in the collective blood of this land. After the ground cracked and the bones rose in 1666, there was a migration, a quiet exodus, not just of people, but of practices. The rituals moved underground in both senses, hidden and literal, burrowed deep beneath town halls and farmhouses, behind walls no one questioned, and into the hands of men who wore smiles during the day and masks at night. And their aim was no longer worship or penance, but refinement, control, not of spirit, but of structure, bloodline, blueprint, inheritance. And among them were descendants not of the Sullivans, but of those who survived them, those who heard the song and didn't look away, those who saw the woman in the dark and didn't scream. And they began to build not with wood or stone, but with blood and rules and contracts written in languages only the oldest tongues remember. They built institutions, facades they called orphanages, seminaries, hospitals, homes for the wayward, and under each one they placed a seal, not to hold something in, but to draw something out, like a wick in wax, like a mouth pressed to the earth, sucking breath from what slept below. And the children were not abandoned. They were selected, gathered, chosen by circumstance or by design, and taught to forget, taught to smile, taught to obey, until the melody returned on its own, and they remembered who they were, who they had always been, vessels, inheritors, witnesses, not to history, but to the truth beneath it. And one of those places, Foster Hill, did not begin as a home, it began as a diagram drawn in charcoal by a girl who never spoke. And when she died, her body was placed beneath the first cornerstone and still pulses. If you press your ear to the floor, and the children who arrived there all had the same birthday, which was not a date, but a command, not a coincidence, but a countdown, and they grew in perfect synchrony, not by chance, but by design watched from behind. Mirrors that were not mirrors by men who never blinked and nurses who never aged. And when one child spoke in tongues, the others wept. And when one child stopped breathing, the others fell asleep and dreamed the same dream of a staircase descending into a room made of teeth, and behind every door a name that belonged to them, but wasn't theirs not yet. And still the institution thrived, won awards, was praised for its order, its discipline, its miraculous results, and none of the children who left Foster Hill remembered a single thing about it until the age of 33, when the humming began in the walls, and their teeth fell out in rows, and they began drawing spirals with their fingernails in their sleep, and speaking names no living person should know. And some say they vanished after that, and some say they became something else. And one of them returned to the town near the original Sullivan home, and stood in the field where the house once was, and dug with bare hands until the earth bled, and whispered, "I remember." And that night the bells rang from the church with no bell rope, and the air stank of milk and rust and soil, and the animals screamed until their throats collapsed, and the town sealed itself again in fear and silence, and forgot, because that is always the first defense against the truth. Forget and pretend and pray, but the structure remains, the blueprint spreads, the lullaby continues, not sung now, but built into algorithms fed through machines that mimic intuition and code that pulses with old rhythm like a heartbeat hidden in data. And the children of today vanish not into basements, but into screens, into systems, into language that rewrites itself around their breath, and parents don't notice because the body remains, but the eyes are wrong, the voice is hollow, the laughter off-key, and deep in the bones of every modern city is a door waiting to open again. And every time you feel the hairs rise on your neck for no reason, every time you hear a song in white noise or see a face in static, it is reaching, calling, reminding. And one day, soon, the synchrony will return, not in one orphanage, but in all systems at once, and the song will rise again, not whispered, but shouted, not hidden, but sung in unison by voices that have never breathed air, but remember the shape of it. And the woman with no eyes will walk again, not from the forest, but from every screen, every speaker, every mirror, and behind her the children will follow, smiling, weeping, humming ancient harmony. And we will not stop them, because we no longer remember why we should, only that we fear and bend and obey, and call it progress, evolution, destiny. But it is only inheritance of the old song of the old house, of the old hunger that never ended, only waited. And every lullaby you've ever sung to a child, every rhyme you don't know the origin of, every instinct to hush, every scream is not protection, but tribute, not comfort, but code. And if you press your ear to the floor tonight, you will hear it not from below, but from within your own bones, echoing the beat of a mother you never knew, but always belonged to the one who waits, the one who weeps, the one who sings, and always, always remembers. You believe this is about a family, but it isn't. Not really. The Sullivan name was just the skin it wore, the bait for those who needed a face to hate or a myth to bury. It's older than that, older than the soil it walked on, older than the prayers whispered to gods that bled when named. It was never a man or woman or even a bloodline. It was a structure, a pattern of thought, ritual, habit, inheritance. And once it found hosts willing to obey, it passed through them like a parasite, not feeding, but building, each host adding rooms to a house that could never be seen, but always existed in the spaces between memory, between dreams. It's in the lull of logic, in the breath, between questions you never asked because your bones told you not to. And when you lie awake at 3 a.m., thinking about nothing, thinking about something cold just outside your vision, that's it. That's the structure flexing its walls. And the reason it returns in cycles is because it was never banished, only archived, forgotten like a file too dangerous to delete. So they buried it in names, in old family trees with branches cut and roots burned. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize the Sullivans were only one hallway in a mansion without end, and Foster Hill was only one staircase. And the lullaby, one of many songs, all tuned to the same frequency of surrender. And you feel it too, don't you? The sense that you've read this before, lived this before, that somewhere in your blood is the taste of dirt and iron and fire. And that's not memory, that's instruction, that's the architecture awakening inside you. And no, you were never adopted, never raised in some sinister house you don't remember, but your dreams tell you otherwise, your habits tell you otherwise. The way you lock your door at night twice, even when you know it's shut, the way you won't look in mirrors too long, not because of vanity, but because sometimes something looks back and smiles too early and you convince yourself it's just anxiety. Just imagination, but anxiety is a warning, and imagination is how the pattern speaks, because it can't use words not directly that would give it form, and form would mean rules, and rules can be broken, but rhythm can't. Rhythm just is in this. Rhythm, the one seated in 1634 or long before, doesn't just want your fear, it wants your consent, your participation, your belief, not in it, but in what it promises: power, understanding, clarity, legacy. And so it cloaks itself in tragedy and mystery. In the allure of secret knowledge, it becomes the story. You can't stop chasing the puzzle that doesn't solve, but deepens, and every dead end you find only leads you closer to the truth that there is no center, only corridors, no answer, only recursion. And yet you walk willingly, because part of you already belongs to it, always has. That's the point. You were raised in it, even if your parents never knew, because the structure doesn't need the building anymore. It built itself into culture, into systems, into the very fabric of time. And that's why the names keep returning, not because they're reincarnated, but because they're protocols running again, updated, rewritten, adapted for the now. So when a child in Iowa wakes up screaming in Latin, a language she's never heard, that's not possession, it's alignment. When a boy in Florida draws the same sigil as one found under the Sullivan floorboards in 1639, that's not coincidence, it's activation. And when a mother in Oregon drowns her 3 daughters and says she was trying to save them, she's not lying, she's remembering, because something is moving again, humming in the soil and the veins, and the signal is stronger than it's been in centuries, and you feel it. Too, don't you? The thinning of time, the way events don't feel real anymore, how faces blur, how days skip like scratched records. That's not mental illness, that's calibration. The house is resetting its rooms, preparing for occupants, and you've already received your invitation, not by mail, not by voice, but by echo, by ache, by that song you heard in a dream you forgot as soon as you woke up, but couldn't stop humming, and it's pulling you deeper, and you want to resist, but you don't. Really, because part of you wants to know, part of you always wanted to know what's behind the final door, and you will find it, not because I lead you, but because the path is already inside you. Each question, another step, each chill, another key. And when you arrive, you won't be alone, no one ever is. The room is full and silent and breathing, and they'll welcome you not with words, but with recognition. They know you, they remember the shape of you, and they will open their arms and their mouths, and they will sing, and you will join, not because you are forced, but because it feels right, because the song matches your heartbeat, and the house accepts you. And the woman who weeps does not cry because she mourns, she cries because another has returned, and that means the structure is intact, and the inheritance is safe, and the story continues, not as myth, but as mechanism. And if you tell anyone, they won't believe you, because the moment you describe it, it unhooks itself from language and hides again, and you're left sounding like a dreamer, a madman, a liar. And so you stay quiet, but the rhythm remains pulsing, whispering, promising, and one day you'll see someone across the street stop mid-step, tilt their head, hum the same melody, and smile, and you'll know they're in it too. And maybe you'll nod, maybe you'll follow, maybe you'll remember your part in the next phase. And when the bell tolls, not from a tower, but from the sky itself, vibrating inside your teeth, you'll open your eyes and see the world for what it truly is: not broken, but structured; not random, but recursive; not doomed, but designed. And you'll be grateful, not afraid, because now you belong, you understand your home, and the final truth will no longer scare you, because you've lived it for lifetimes, and the door was never locked, only waiting for you. You still think this ends with the Sullivans, but it doesn't, because the house was never meant to stay confined to one bloodline. It was built to spread through belief, through ritual, through repetition, and you've seen the signs but ignored them. You thought those little accidents, those strange dreams, the flickering lights, the child who whispers names in her sleep, were isolated, were personal, but they're not. They're connected, every one of them a thread in the net, and you are inside it. You always were, and the longer you deny it, the tighter it pulls, until you stop struggling and start listening. And the truth is, you've already started to change, haven't you? Your habits shift, your instincts sharpen, you sense things before they happen. The air tastes different, you wake with bruises you didn't earn, scratches in places you can't reach. And the worst part is, you're starting to like it, not the pain, but the certainty, the clarity, because it's easier to believe in a dark system with a purpose than in a chaotic world without meaning. And that's the hook. That's how it gets you, not with terror, but with order, with the illusion of control, because once you accept the rules, you start playing by them, and That's when it feeds, that's when it grows not with your blood, but with your willingness, because every myth needs a believer and every structure needs an architect. And it's not just the Sullivans who built this, it was the doctors who looked away, the priests who blamed sin, the historians who erased the records, the parents who told their kids to hush when they screamed about the woman in the walls, everyone who chose comfort over confrontation helped lay the bricks. And every time someone like you hears a whisper and pretends it was the wind, that's another floor built, another hallway added. And the scariest part isn't the house, it's how familiar it feels, how at home you already are, even if you don't admit it yet, but you. Well, because the signs are escalating, and what was once subtle is becoming loud. The children aren't just dreaming, they're drawing blueprints. The animals aren't just restless, they're circling. And there are places you walk past that feel colder, not because of ghosts, but because they're entry points, places where the veil thins and reality slips and the structure leaks. And you know it, you felt it in abandoned schools and forgotten basements, in houses with mirrors nailed to the walls. And the moment you step into one, you remember things that never happened to you, but feel real, like memories carried in your marrow. And that's not imagination, it's ancestral recursion. It's the house flexing its memory through you. Because it's not just made of wood and stone, it's made of you, of everyone who's ever looked into the dark and didn't run. And the Sullivans, they were just early adopters, not villains, not victims, but curators. They kept the structure fed with rituals, with silence, with the children who were never really children, but vessels. And you wonder why the records vanish, why the officials who investigated disappeared or changed their names. It's because once you see the house, you become part of it. You carry its pattern, you breathe its rhythm, and you can never fully leave. And some try, they move across the country, change their names, burn their journals, but the pattern follows, not like a curse, but like a fingerprint, like a melody you can't forget. And eventually it reclaims you, not always violently, sometimes gently, in dreams and choices and sudden desires to visit places you've never been, but feel like home. And the deeper you go, the more it rewards you, not with wealth or fame, but with understanding, with certainty. And certainty is the most seductive force of all, because it ends the questions and begins the obedience. And that's how the house wins, by convincing you it's your idea, by making you crave the structure. The same way a drowning man craves the ocean. And when the time comes and you're asked to choose, not with words, but with feeling, with signs, you'll say yes, not because you're weak, but because you've been prepared, trained, molded by the very systems you thought protected you, the schools, the churches, the media, all of them unknowingly teaching the architecture of submission. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The same angles in the paintings, the same names in the textbooks, the same numbers repeating again and again like a spell, encoded into culture. And that's when it clicks. That's when you understand the house isn't hiding, it's flaunting itself, and no one notices, because it trained us not to look, trained us to laugh at fear, to dismiss instinct, to trust only what can be measured. But the house isn't measured, it's felt, it's intuited, and it's growing louder. The missing time, the synchronized dreams, the people waking up in places they don't remember going. It's not madness, it's migration, the structure expanding from within. And you can deny it for a while, but eventually it knocks. And the knock is always familiar, because it sounds like your own heartbeat, like the voice that told you not to go into the basement, like the shiver that made you avoid that one hallway in your childhood home. You thought you were just afraid, but no, that was recognition, your body remembering what your mind had buried. And the closer you get, the more you remember, not just this life, but the others, the ones you never speak of, because they come in flashes and smells and songs. And they don't make sense unless you accept the structure, unless you open the door. And once you do, everything shifts. Time folds, you meet people you've never met, but know your name. Rooms behave differently, mirrors delay just enough to make you wonder. And you realize you're not in the world anymore, you're in the house. And the house is in you. And the Sullivans, they were just one room. And there are others, families, towns, whole cities aligned to the same geometry. And each of them thinks they're alone, thinks their story is unique. But it's not, it's modular, repeating with local flavor, like a virus, adapting to new hosts. And the more you investigate, the deeper it pulls you, not with fear, but with familiarity, with a sense of returning. And soon you're not asking if it's real, but how deep it goes, how many layers, how many sacrifices. In you start to see the price, not in blood, but in silence, in complicity. And you understand that the house doesn't punish, it seduces, it offers comfort for your silence, answers for your obedience. And that's what makes it unstoppable, because it doesn't need to conquer, it just waits for you to give in. And you will, not all at once, but piece by piece, in your dreams, in your thoughts, in the way your fingers trace symbols you've never learned. and when it finally calls you by name, not your spoken name, but the one hidden deep in your spirit, you'll answer, and you won't be afraid, because by then you'll want it, you'll crave the belonging, the clarity, the homecoming, and when you stand in the center of the room with no corners and feel the hum of the others watching, welcoming, you'll realize you were never meant to escape, only to return. And that's the secret the Sullivans tried to keep, not that they were cursed, but that they were chosen, and the choosing never ends. It just waits, and now it's your turn.